Hey guys, today I'll show you a horror thriller TV series named The Terror, Season 2, Infamy. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The story is set during World War II, around the 1940s. It centers around a group of Japanese-American immigrants in the United States who experience terrifying supernatural events. The scene opens with a Japanese woman named Mrs. Furuya being shown dressing up in front of a mirror. After she finishes, she gets up and leaves the room. The camera then focuses on a family photo on the table, showing a family of 3, with Mrs. Furuya being one of them. She walks towards the dock by the shore, but suddenly her steps become stiff and her body seizes up. She collapses to the ground, seemingly controlled by some unseen force. She pulls out a hairpin and slowly inserts it into her own ear. Cut to Mrs. Furuya's funeral. A man named Chester appears, noticing a loose thread on his cuff and instinctively pulling on it. To his surprise, the thread keeps getting longer. When he looks at his wrist, he finds a large scar, and the thread appears to be coming from the wound. Startled, he takes a closer look, but the wound and thread are gone. He then approaches the Japanese woman's body to pay his respects. At this moment, he recalls his past interactions with the deceased woman. Mrs. Furuya had been preparing a type of medicine for Chester and promised him that it would be ready within a week, assuring him that all his problems would be solved. This exchange is an important setup for the events that unfold later in the story. The scene cuts back to reality, where the final part of Mrs. Furuya's funeral is taking place. The attendees are gathering for a photo with her coffin, and Chester is the photographer. Before the photo is taken, Mr. Furuya hands him 2 vials of medicine, calling him a coward. From the shape of the bottles, Chester realizes they are the same ones Mrs. Furuya had given him in the earlier flashback. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind knocks over the coffin, causing Mrs. Furuya's body to tumble out. Chester's mother immediately senses something is wrong. In Japanese tradition, this is a bad omen, a sign that an evil spirit may be about to appear. Chester's father, Henry, dismisses the idea, saying they had been away from Japan for so long, how could an evil spirit show up now? Clearly, both parents know more than they are letting on. The scene shifts to Chester taking photos on the fishing boat where his father works. Through the camera lens, he briefly sees Mrs. Furuya's body again, but brushes it off as a trick of the eye. The boat owner, Yamato, jokingly asks the group if anyone saw a spirit at Mrs. Furuya's funeral. Chester, skeptical, laughs it off, thinking it's just old superstitions. He wonders even if there were spirits, why they would travel all this way just to mess with them. One of the fishermen retorts him by saying that they did travel all this way to America. Just then, an American fisheries officer arrives on the dock. He immediately undervalues the catch, cutting the price of fish from the market rate, slicing it in half. Henry is furious, but bites his tongue. This scene reflects the harsh realities faced by Japanese immigrants in America at the time, a period when U.S.-Japan relations were extremely tense, teetering on the brink of war. After finishing work, Henry drives Chester home. On the way, Chester bumps into his friend, a U.S. serviceman, and they chat for a bit. Meanwhile, Henry notices a propaganda poster that urges people to report anything suspicious. The serviceman warns Chester that things are tense in America, with Japanese spies being hunted everywhere, reinforcing the dangerous state of U.S.-Japan relations. Chester also has an American girlfriend named Luz, and the two have been intimate. One day, Chester meets Luz and gives her 2 vials of the medicine that Mrs. Furuya had prepared for him. Luz is now pregnant with Chester's child, and the medicine is meant to deal with the child. Chester explains how to use it and then leaves. Meanwhile, Henry delivers the fish he caught to the fisheries officer at the processing plant, who sticks to his earlier statement, saying the original price is out of the question but hinting that half of that price might be negotiable. At that moment, one of the factory machines suddenly breaks down, and as the officer goes to inspect it, his tie gets caught in the conveyor belt. In a critical moment, Henry grabs a knife and cuts the officer's tie, saving him from a serious accident. Later that evening, Chester returns home and begins developing the photos he took earlier in the day. One particular photo catches his eye. There's a faint, shadowy figure in it, but Chester doesn't think much of it. During dinner, the family gathers around the table, discussing everyday matters. Besides Chester's immediate family, his uncle's family is also present, including their daughter, Amy. Chester reveals his desire to leave the fishing life behind and move to the mainland to pursue a career as a professional photographer. However, his mother quickly shuts down the idea, insisting that being a fisherman is a stable, honorable job, especially with the world at war. After dinner, Chester and Amy take a walk along the boardwalk by the beach. Amy reveals that the late Mrs. Furuya was often abused by her husband, especially when he was drunk. Just then, they catch a glimpse of a shadowy figure of a woman in a kimono behind them. Clearly, something is not right. Meanwhile, someone knocks on Henry's door. It's the fisheries officer who almost died in the factory accident earlier. He's been fired from his job because of the mistake that damaged the machine, and now he's putting all the blame on Henry. He even accuses Henry and his family of being Japanese spies. Despite Henry's attempts to explain, the officer is just there to cause trouble. He demands compensation for his firing, and what he wants is Henry's newly purchased car. Powerless to resist, Henry watches as the officer drives away with the car. Later, Chester confronts his father, telling him that times have changed. They don't have to keep suffering under the fisheries officer's oppression. Chester believes they should stand up for themselves, but Henry, always cautious, tells Chester he doesn't want to cause trouble for the family. Keeping the peace is most important. They can always earn back a stolen car, but if something worse happens, it could ruin them. The scene shifts to Mr. Furuya's house. Chester's mother visits him and his son, bringing food. As they eat, she discreetly sprinkles something that looks like rice outside their window. She warns Mr. Furuya that an evil spirit has arrived. It seems she knows more than she's letting on. Furious, Mr. Furuya dismisses her bullshit and sends her smelly butt away. Later, he goes out for a drink, feeling troubled. On his way home, he encounters a strange figure. The scene becomes hazy as he passes by a woman in a kimono. Something clicks in his mind, and when he turns back to look, the woman is gone. Suddenly, it's as if something takes hold of him. Staring directly at the sun, he lets out a painful scream. Later that night, Chester and his friends head to a club to unwind. Each of his friends pairs up with a woman and heads upstairs, but Chester decides to stay behind, telling them to have fun while he'll wait downstairs. As he stands there, the same woman in the kimono appears at the stairway, the same one Mr. Furuya saw earlier. The scene becomes hazy again as Chester, intrigued, picks up his camera to take pictures. The woman invites Chester upstairs for tea. Through their conversation, we learn her name is Yuko. Chester is distracted, burdened by the guilt of asking his girlfriend Luz to give up their child. Yuko leads Chester to a room and performs a tea leaf reading, offering him advice and encouragement. She tells him not to make decisions he'll regret, urging him to find his way. After listening to Yuko's advice, Chester decides to make a change. He sneaks over to the officer's house, where he takes back his father's car. However, the officer quickly realizes what's happened. Chester then rushes to see Luz. When he finds out she hasn't yet taken the medicine to get rid of the child, he is overjoyed. Chester tells her that he has the car now and suggests they run away together. But Luz points out the flaws in his plan, asking where they should go since they don't have money, no steady jobs. In this uncertain situation, they have no future. Luz admits she's still unsure whether she'll take the medicine. She's not ready to make a decision yet. Feeling disappointed, Chester leaves. The scene then cuts back to the fisheries officer, who assumes it was Henry who stole the car. Furious, he sneaks onto Henry's fishing boat in the middle of the night, intending to burn it down. As he prepares to ignite the kerosene, a gust of wind blows through, not only extinguishing the fire, but also knocking the officer to the ground. The next morning, Henry and the crew were cleaning the fishing boat when the captain noticed that someone had messed with the nets at the bow. When they pulled the nets out of the water, they were shocked to find the body of the officer tangled in them, with his eyes showing the same eerie condition as Mr. Furuya's. Now they were in serious trouble since a dead American had been found on a Japanese fishing boat. Chester and Henry were brought to the police station for questioning. Henry was convinced that this was the work of the evil spirit. Just then, the town's alarm sirens went off. Chester's serviceman friend rushed over and told them they needed to leave immediately. That day, without warning, Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor, and the country was now at war with the United States. Chester hurried home and developed the photos he had taken earlier. Among them were several blurry shots of Yuko, just like before. He barely had time to process this when U.S. military and FBI agents arrived in the Japanese neighborhood. They were rounding up Japanese men for questioning, and Henry was among those taken. As he was led away, Henry reassured his son, telling him that he's an American and he should fight for his country. On the other note, Yuko sits in front of a mirror doing her makeup. Suddenly, her skin begins to peel off. Calmly, she pulls out a needle and starts stitching her face back together, suggesting the incoming horrors. The scene shifts to February 27, 1942, several months after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. By this time, the U.S. government has enacted Executive Order 9066. The core of this order allows the government to seize land for military purposes in times of necessity and relocate its residents to designated areas. The U.S. Navy began large-scale confiscation efforts, and much of the property owned by Japanese Americans on the West Coast was taken and forfeited to the government. During this period, nearly 120,000 Japanese Americans were forcibly relocated to internment camps, which were essentially another form of concentration camps. 1 week after the issuance of the executive order, the U.S. government has started forcibly relocating Japanese residents from the town. Chester's serviceman friend comes to see him and tells him that due to Japan's surprise attack on the U.S., the Navy has requisitioned the island, and all Japanese residents must leave. Any items that could potentially be used for espionage, such as radios, flashlights, and cameras, must be surrendered. When Chester hears that his camera will be confiscated, he has trouble accepting it. The serviceman explains that it's a good thing he's the one delivering the news. If someone else had come, they'd be in real trouble, especially since the fisheries officer's death remains unsolved. Chester asks about his father, who was taken away. The serviceman's only response is a cryptic one. Wherever Henry is, he's safer than here. This is a clear warning. After packing up the essentials, Chester and his mother head to the government's designated relocation site. Since he still has a car, Chester also takes along Amy's family and Furuya's son. Chester drives everyone to a hotel in town where many displaced Japanese families are staying. While they are going upstairs, Amy's father suddenly catches a glimpse of the mysterious woman Yuko. The scene becomes hazy again, and when he looks back, Yuko is gone without traces of her smell. From his reaction, it seems like Amy's father recognizes her. Amy's mother asks what's wrong, and he only replies that he thought he saw someone. After settling his family in, Chester returns to school, where his classmates give him cold, suspicious looks. Chester had dropped out of school after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Chester finds his teacher and returns the equipment he borrowed, showing him the photos he took, including the ones with the blurred figure. The teacher gives two possible explanations. From a photography and scientific perspective, the blurring could be due to camera shake or holding the shutter open for too long. However, from his Jewish mother's point of view, Chester might have captured something supernatural. While they are talking, Chester spots someone outside the window. It's Luce. He chases after her and is shocked to see that her belly is now very large. They hadn't seen each other since their last encounter, and Chester had assumed she had terminated the pregnancy. To his surprise, Luce explains that she kept the baby. She tells Chester about her mother, who died from severe hemorrhaging during childbirth. Her grandmother had named Luz and said goodbye in her mother's final moments. Because of this, Luz doesn't want to dishonor her mother's love. She wants to live meaningfully, perhaps by becoming a nun or a nurse. However, meeting Chester changed her plans, and she simply wanted to build a life with him. The pregnancy was unexpected. Chester wants to support Luz, but given his current circumstances, he's barely managing to take care of himself, let alone someone else. Reality is harsh, and he doesn't have the means to help her. Before they part ways, Luz tells Chester that she now works at an orphanage and plans to send the baby there after it's born. Despite his reluctance, Chester knows there's little he can do, and they part on tense terms. That night, back at the hotel, Chester lies in bed unable to sleep. Suddenly, he hears a noise outside the window. When he looks, he sees Yuko. He rushes out to the hallway, but no one is there. The next morning, Chester goes to the club where he first met Yuko, hoping to find out more about her. To his surprise, the club owner tells him that no one by the name of Yuko has ever worked there. Chester is even more confused by the revelation. Meanwhile, Mr. Furuya is being held in custody. He had mysteriously gone blind earlier, and suddenly Yuko appears before him again, asking if he still remembers her, sending chills down through his spine to the butt. Henry and Yamato are also being held together in the same facility. Seeing Mr. Furuya's condition, Yamato quietly pulls something out and places it in his mouth. He tells Henry that it's a protective chant to ward off evil spirits and offers Henry some. Curious, Henry asks if the evil spirits could really follow them here. Yamato thinks so, pointing to Mr. Furuya as proof. He's clearly been attacked by something supernatural. Yamato also mentions that several other Japanese men in the facility have recently disappeared. While they are discussing this, a suspicious guy approaches them, trying to be friendly. However, Yamato had just mentioned that the missing men were connected to the suspicious guy, so neither of them engages much with him. Life in the detention center is anything but stable. The next day, an officer takes Henry to a completely frozen lake. Hearing that Henry was once a fisherman, the officer assigns him the task of ice fishing. Henry stands at the vast, icy lake, unsure of what to do. He's never ice fished before. By evening, the officer returns to find Henry sitting alone on the ice. Although Henry is unharmed, the fish he caught are small and unimpressive. The story shifts back to Chester. The Japanese residents staying at the hotel receive another notice from the U.S. government, saying that everyone must relocate again, this time to a horse ranch on the outskirts of town, and each person is only allowed 2 suitcases. Luz, who works at the orphanage, is also affected by the relocation order. Soldiers arrive at the orphanage to take away all the Japanese children, including infants. Luz, worried about her unborn child, tentatively asks what will happen in her case. The soldier bluntly tells her that any child with even a drop of Japanese blood will be taken. Soon, a large number of Japanese residents are transported to the horse ranch. Chester notices the presence of many children and asks a nearby soldier where they came from. The soldier informs him that they were taken from the orphanage. This news makes Chester panic, as his pregnant girlfriend works there. Chester then confides in his mother, telling her about Luz's pregnancy and his decision to be there for her, since Luz has decided to keep the baby. After saying his goodbyes to his mother, Chester sneaks away and heads to the orphanage, where he finds Luz. Luz is understandably anxious, having just witnessed soldiers take all the Japanese children. Chester suggests they run away together and move to another state. He has already planned their escape route and intends to use his father's car. With no other options, Luz agrees to leave with Chester. The scene cuts back to Chester's mother and the other Japanese residents, who have been crammed into dark, damp, and foul-smelling stables. Everyone starts cleaning and tidying up the area. While dumping garbage, Furuya's son encounters Yuko. She touches his handsome but timid face, remarking that he looks just like his mother. Just then, Amy arrives and calls the boy away. Meanwhile, Chester packs his things and takes Luz to his teacher's house. As they knock on the door, the elderly neighbor spots them. Inside, the teacher allows them to stay temporarily until things settle down. Chester asks the teacher for help finding a job and a place where Luz can receive medical care. The teacher thinks for a moment and mentions that she has some friends in New Mexico where Chester might be able to work and live. It seems like things are starting to fall into place for them. However, later that night, 2 FBI agents burst into the teacher's home. As a Japanese-American, Chester has violated the government's orders and must come with them. It turns out the elderly neighbor had reported Chester. As the FBI agents lead him away, Luz follows, insisting on going with him despite not being Japanese. Since she is pregnant with a Japanese child, she joins Chester as they are taken to the horse ranch, where Japanese residents are being held. There, Chester introduces Luz to his mother. On the other side, Yamato, Henry, and Mr. Furuya are in the woods gathering firewood. Recently, several more people have gone missing from the internment camp. Yamato has noticed that all the missing individuals have had some connection with the suspicious guy. He suspects that the suspicious guy might be an evil spirit. At this rate, it's only a matter of time before one of them disappears, so they decide to confront him. Their chance soon comes when the officer assigns the 3 to go fishing together again. The suspicious guy is sent along with them. The 4 men make their way to the frozen lake and begin drilling holes in the ice. Henry and the others start interrogating the suspicious guy about the evil spirit. At first, he denies everything, claiming he knows nothing about any evil spirit. But as they break the ice around him, he finally confesses. It turns out he is working for the Department of Justice, investigating Japanese spies in the camp. The missing individuals were people he reported, although he admits he had no idea if they were actually spies. He just reported them to gain the trust of the Justice Department. Enraged by his betrayal, Henry and the others view him as a traitor to his own people. In the end, they leave him stranded on the cracked ice, letting him face the consequences of his actions on his own. The story returns to Chester and his group. While busy with tasks, Amy's father suddenly spots Yuko. The screen edges blur, and it's clear he recognizes her. Sensing danger, he turns and shouts to Chester, telling him to run. But before anything can happen, Amy's father becomes possessed by Yuko. He grabs a gun and approaches several guards. After they issue warnings to stop, the soldiers are forced to shoot him, killing him on the spot. That night, everyone is grieving the death of Amy's father. Amy's mother is confused and suspicious, wondering why her husband yelled for Chester to run just before the incident. She questions if Chester may have brought the evil spirit into their lives. Chester, unable to explain, feels deeply unsettled, knowing that something is definitely wrong. Before long, the military orders another relocation. This time, they are to be moved to a camp known as the War Relocation Center, which is more like an internment camp than a temporary shelter. The scene shifts to May 1942, about 2 months after the previous events. The residents of the internment camp are watching a Western film from Daniel CC Movie Channel, with Chester and Luz also in attendance. Halfway through the movie, Chester suddenly hears Amy's father's last words telling him to run. At the same time, the movie shows a scene of Amy's father being killed, and Chester feels overwhelmed with discomfort. He leaves the theater to get some fresh air. The camp's searchlights occasionally sweep across Chester as he steps outside. After the movie ends, everyone returns to their living quarters. Chester and his family are staying in a shared barrack, while Luce, being pregnant, is housed in a special barrack for expectant mothers. However, as an American, Luce faces discrimination from the other pregnant women. The living conditions in the regular barracks are harsh, noisy, and chaotic, with searchlights continuously sweeping past Chester's window during the night. The next day, Chester and Luce take a walk around the camp. They have no idea how long this internment will last, 2 weeks, 2 months, or even 2 years. As they talk, Yuko watches them from a corner, unseen by the couple. Meanwhile, Chester's mother and Amy's mother are working in the camp, trying to farm some land. Despite repeated efforts, the crops refuse to grow properly. Luce walks by and Amy's mother comments that she feels sorry for her. Luce truly loves Chester. But Chester's mother doesn't agree, believing that Luce has ruined Chester's life. As Chester's mother talks with Amy's mother, she notices that among the withered crops, a single pepper plant has grown. She's overjoyed, seeing it as a symbol of new life and hope. However, when she picks the pepper and takes a bite, she finds it filled with maggots. This is a subtle hint that the new life they hoped for may already be corrupted. The U.S. officer in charge of the camp, Major Bowen, makes his presence known. He believes he's humorous, but deep down, he looks down on the Japanese. When he sees Chester at the construction site for the camp's fence, he both compliments and mocks him, praising the Japanese as hard-working while pushing them to build the fence faster, because of course he doesn't want any of them escaping. The irony of having the Japanese build the walls that imprison them isn't lost on anyone. The U.S. military is recruiting Japanese translators. However, most of the interned Japanese view those cooperating with the U.S. with disdain. Chester, too, is frustrated by the idea of Japanese people being forced to help imprison their own. That night, Chester's mother is asleep when Amy wakes her up, saying that Henry and the others have returned. Sure enough, Henry, Yamato, and the now blind Mr. Furuya have come back, but Henry's condition is poor. He walks with a limp, clearly in pain. What exactly happened to them in the detention center? Chester helps his father inside the barracks, and when Henry removes his shoes, everyone sees that his feet are badly frostbitten. Chester asks what happened, but before Henry can answer, Mr. Furuya interjects, wondering if he hasn't told them yet. Henry quickly cuts him off, telling him not to say another word, and Mr. Furuya stays silent. Just then, the camp's searchlight sweeps over them again, and Chester, now fed up, sneaks up to the watchtower during the guard shift change and smashes the searchlight. The next morning, Henry wakes up and looks at Amy's father's ashes with a heavy heart, remarking that he was the most careful of all of them, and now he's dead like a piece of soap. Chester's mother tries to comfort him, saying that the protective talisman will keep them safe. But Henry disagrees, saying it may ward off evil spirits, but it can't protect them from the ugliness of human nature. He expresses frustration that there are spies among them, trading their people's safety for personal gain. Just then, Chester arrives with Luz to visit his father. As Chester's future daughter-in-law, Luz brings Henry a basin of water to wash his face. However, still distrustful of her, Henry knocks over the water and questions Chester, asking how he knows she isn't a spy. Left with no choice, Chester takes Luz away for the time being. At lunch, Chester and Yamato discuss Amy's father's possession. Yamato firmly believes he was taken over by an evil spirit, and Chester agrees that something was very wrong. As they talk, Mr. Furuya, stiff and awkward, stumbles into the mess hall. Seeing something strange in his behavior, his son approaches him, only for Mr. Furuya to grab his throat and begin choking him, muttering repeatedly that the swallows are everywhere. The fact that Mr. Furuya is possessed in front of so many people shows that the evil spirit is becoming more brazen. Soldiers rush over and forcibly restrain him. Meanwhile, Amy and her mother go to see Major Bowen. He's currently hiring a secretary who knows Japanese, and after hearing that Amy is a capable worker, he hires her on the spot. That night, Chester sneaks past the guards, bringing half a bottle of liquor to visit Mr. Furuya, who was detained earlier. By now, Mr. Furuya has returned to his senses. Chester asks him what happened during the day and why he attacked his son. Mr. Furuya insists it wasn't him, that he felt something controlling his body. Chester, though never possessed himself, admits that he feels like he's seen this evil spirit before. He begins to suspect that the mysterious woman Yuko may be involved. As Chester prepares to leave, Mr. Furuya's appearance suddenly changes. He transforms into the image of Amy's father, repeating the same ominous phrase that the swallows are everywhere. Startled, Chester hurries out. But when he looks back, everything seems normal again, as if nothing had happened. The next morning, Chester went to the barracks for pregnant women to look for Luz. When he arrived, he overheard that she had gone to the infirmary, which made him rush there in a panic. Upon entering, Chester heard Luz arguing with the doctor. It turned out that Luz had taken a fall, and out of concern for the baby, she went to get checked. The doctor, however, barely examined her and simply put a bandage on her arm, dismissing the situation. The language barrier was the problem. Luz didn't speak Japanese, and the doctor didn't speak English, making communication difficult. After Chester stepped in to help translate, the doctor finally did a thorough examination, and fortunately, the baby was fine. Later, Chester asked Luz how she fell, but she couldn't explain clearly. She just said she slipped. Chester didn't say anything, but deep down, he suspected it might have something to do with the evil spirit. One night, an American soldier entered Mr. Furuya's cell, unlocked the door, and took him into the forest. The soldier moved with the same stiff, unnatural gait that Mrs. Furuya had when she was possessed by the evil spirit previously. After leading Mr. Furuya deep into the woods, the soldier turned and left. Suddenly, Yuko appeared behind Mr. Furuya. She asked if he remembered what he had said to her. Mr. Furuya couldn't remember and begged Yuko to spare his family. Enraged, Yuko bit off Mr. Furuya's juicy tongue, disabling his tongue massaging skills before ending his tongueless life in the woods. The next morning, a child found Mr. Furuya's body while retrieving a ball in the woods, and he also caught a glimpse of Yuko. The camp was soon in an uproar, with everyone speculating that an evil spirit was responsible. Chester heard from others that the child had seen a woman in a kimono near Mr. Furuya's body. Chester then found Amy's brother and shared this information with him. Combining this with Amy's father's last words and their recent experiences, Chester became convinced that the spirit was targeting him specifically. He believed that if he left, the spirit would follow him and leave everyone else alone. But how could Chester leave the camp? He came up with a plan: enlist in the army. Since the military was recruiting translators, Chester, fluent in both Japanese and English, was the perfect candidate. He volunteered for the position and passed the interview with ease, thanks to his keen observation skills and language abilities. He was officially accepted by the U.S. military. Chester then showed Luz the letter confirming his enlistment, which said he would be leaving in 2 days. Luz was overwhelmed, unable to process the news. Chester didn't know exactly where he would be going or for how long, but the plan was to first assemble in Minnesota. The job came with a high salary, offering the chance to earn good money. Luz couldn't understand what was the point of money if he was leaving. What she didn't realize was that Chester felt he had no choice. He wanted to confront the evil spirit alone, to prevent it from harming his family any further, especially Luz and their unborn child. But things didn't seem to really go as Chester hoped. As they shared their emotional farewell without a tongue massage, Yuko watched them from a distance, hidden from view. The day of departure arrived quickly. Chester packed his bags and went to say goodbye to his father. After what had happened in the detention center, Henry had lost all faith in the U.S. government. He had once urged Chester to see America as his homeland, but now he regretted it, unable to accept that Chester was going to work for the same country that had betrayed them. After a brief farewell, Chester left. Before leaving, he sold his beloved camera and used the money to buy a dress for Luz as a parting gift. They shared a kiss goodbye. Chester's mother cut a lock of his hair. If Chester didn't return, this would be cremated in his place, leaving the family something to remember him by. And so, Chester left the camp with the military, heading off to face the evil spirit on his own. After Chester has left, Luz experiences some prenatal bleeding, and feeling uneasy about returning to the Japanese doctor she had clashed with earlier, she seeks out a different midwife to check on the baby. The Japanese nurse reassures Luz that everything is fine. However, it turns out that the nurse is actually Yuko in disguise. The scene shifts to August 1942, 3 months after the previous events. After completing his training, Chester has been deployed to the front lines on Guadalcanal Island. His main duties involve translating and decoding Japanese documents. He shares a tent with another translator named Ogawa. Things have been relatively quiet for Chester over the past few months, with no strange occurrences. However, he remains on edge, convinced that the evil spirit is still following him. He's purchased a new camera and takes photos whenever he hears something unusual around the camp. Despite taking many pictures, he hasn't captured any signs of the spirit. During a conversation with Ogawa, an important name comes up. It's Admiral Takahashi, who serves for the Japanese army. It seems that the U.S. military is investigating him. Chester also brings up the topic of evil spirits, but Ogawa doesn't know much. However, he's heard that if spirits do exist, their actions are driven by their unresolved resentment and desires. Something tragic must have happened to them while they were alive, causing their spirits to linger with unfinished business. They also come across a troubling issue. Many of the captured Japanese letters contain mentions of evil spirits. Just as they're talking, a sudden gust of wind blows through the tent, and Chester notices 3 large slashes on the tent's walls. Ogawa tries to calm Chester, suggesting that it was probably caused by wild animals in the jungle, which is a common occurrence. The scene then shifts to Luz in the internment camp back in the U.S. Her belly has grown significantly since Chester left. Over time, Chester's family has begun to accept Luz, even though they initially didn't like the fact that she's American. But now, she's carrying their grandchild, and she has started to blend into the traditional Japanese family life. Luz finds herself admiring the closeness and warmth of the family, imagining how perfect everything will be once the baby is born, the war is over, and Chester returns home. Little does she know, the nurse performing her checkups is not who she appears to be. Despite this, Yuko doesn't seem outwardly malicious at this point. After her latest examination, Yuko even gives Luz a small rattle as a gift for the unborn baby. Her true purpose remains to be seen as the story unfolds. Back to Chester, his superior officer comes to find him and Ogawa. Due to the brutality of war, the American soldiers on the front lines are not friendly toward their Japanese-American comrades. The officer takes them to a pit filled with dead Japanese soldiers. Officially, they claim these POWs died from illness, but that wasn't entirely true. As Chester approached the bodies, he could see that several had been shot at close range. One particularly hostile soldier, already upset, becomes furious at Chester, blaming him and his people for the heavy American casualties. The officer brought Chester there to investigate the disappearance of a U.S. sergeant who went missing during a reconnaissance mission. The American forces were engaged in a battle with Admiral Takahashi's Japanese troops at the time, and the Japanese soldiers in this pit were captured after the sergeant disappeared. Despite all efforts, none of the prisoners were willing to say anything. The officer hopes Chester can find some clues from the bodies. It's important to note that this officer is not Chester's direct superior. Chester belongs to the intelligence unit, while this officer is from the combat unit. Because of poor communication between the units, the combat team killed the prisoners before intelligence could question them. After a brief discussion, Chester goes down into the pit to search for clues. As expected, he finds a belt on one of the corpses with an English code inscribed on it. Seeing the discovery, the officer orders his men to thoroughly search the pit. Meanwhile, the soldier who had been hostile toward Chester continues to glare at him with resentment. This is just another day in Chester's life at the front. Despite the challenges, he stays in touch with Luz, frequently exchanging letters and sending photos. Whenever Luz receives a letter from Chester, she is overjoyed, relieved to know that he is still alive. One day, Luz asks Chester's mother about her experience giving birth to Chester. Chester's mother replies that she doesn't remember much since too much time has passed. Luz finds this odd, wondering how a mother could forget such a significant event. That night, a smelly soldier is patrolling the internment camp when he notices a light coming from one of the warehouse buildings. Curious, he enters the building to investigate, only to be confronted by a terrifying Yuko with chills sent down through his spine to his smelly butt. The scene shifts, and it's clear the smelly soldier has been possessed. With a bottle of wine in hand, he climbs the watchtower. The other soldiers call out to him, confused by his behavior, but he doesn't respond. Without hesitation, the possessed, smelly soldier jumps from the tower, ending his butt-smelly life. Major Bowen, who witnesses the event, is shocked. Upon inspecting the scene, he finds the bottle of wine and assumes that the soldier was drunk and had an accident. The smell of the wine convinces him that the Japanese are responsible, accusing them of getting the soldier intoxicated. He immediately orders a large-scale search of the internment camp. When the search reaches Henry's barracks, Amy intervenes, pleading on their behalf. Since she is Major Bowen's secretary, she assumes he will show her some leniency. However, Bowen doesn't give her any special treatment. In fact, he insists on searching Amy's belongings himself, looking for the original wine. They don't find anything under Amy's bed, but they discover the wine hidden under Henry's bed. Now that Bowen has a scapegoat, he prepares to arrest Henry. At that moment, Amy's brother steps forward and takes the blame, claiming he brewed the wine himself and that his father only drank it. Bowen is satisfied with having someone to blame, so Amy's brother is arrested instead. Luce went back to Yuko for another prenatal checkup. After listening to the baby's heartbeats, Yuko informed Luce that she was expecting twins. Overjoyed, Luce rushed to share the news with Chester's mother, and they even planned to write to Chester about it. However, Chester's mother wasn't as excited, as in Japanese culture, twins were sometimes considered a bad omen. Determined to change this perception, Luce began studying Japanese diligently and even wrote a heartfelt letter of gratitude to Henry. She said that if she had a boy, she would name him in honor of Henry, but if he didn't like the name, he could choose another. Her broken Japanese touched Henry's heart, softening his usual cold demeanor. For the first time, he warmly told Luce that he liked the name. Meanwhile, Chester began feeling unsettled. While reviewing documents, he suddenly had a vision where Ogawa transformed into Yuko. Shaking it off, he realized it was just another hallucination. Chester then resumed reading a journal recovered from a dead Japanese soldier, which detailed how their unit, stationed near a cave called the Giant's Gate, encountered a malevolent spirit. Suddenly, Chester imagined someone stabbing him, but Chester wasn't dead. This was yet another hallucination. Once he snapped back to reality, Chester deduced that the missing American sergeant might have gone to the Giant's Gate. Acting on Chester's lead, his superiors found the sergeant. However, after returning, the sergeant acted bizarrely, repeatedly muttering in Japanese that Chester is the white demon and they must kill it. When Chester approached, the sergeant became agitated, threatening him that he would gouge out his eyes, cut off his tongue, and kill him. Chester demanded to know who the sergeant had become, but the half-crazed sergeant only repeated one phrase: survival of the fittest. Back at the internment camp, Luce's water suddenly broke. She was going into labor. Her family rushed her to the doctor. In pain, Luce desperately asked for her midwife. The others didn't take her request seriously, and the doctor began preparing for delivery. As a nurse gathered supplies, Yuko silently entered the medical room by possessing the nurse's body. Through the nurse, Yuko arrived at Luce's side, offering comfort throughout the agonizing labor. After a difficult delivery, Luce gave birth to 2 babies, but tragically, both were stillborn. Around this time, Chester finally received the letter Luce had written, telling him about the twins. He was unaware that his children had already died. While Chester was still imagining a hopeful future with Luce and their children, the vengeful soldier from earlier showed up with a group of soldiers, bringing the now possessed sergeant along. They attacked Chester, and the sergeant joined in, eager to unleash his rage. However, things took an unexpected turn. The sergeant pulled out a flamethrower and killed the soldiers who had come with him. Fortunately, Chester was pinned under the bodies of the other soldiers and managed to escape unharmed. Throughout the chaos, the sergeant continued muttering that he will kill the white demon, and he serves Admiral Takahashi. Once again, Takahashi's name looms large. It seems like Admiral Takahashi and his unit have a mysterious connection to the spirit world. After losing her children, Luce lay in her hospital bed, devastated. Her family debated whether or not to inform Chester, who was still at war. In the midst of this discussion, Luce expressed her wish to tell her midwife Yuko what had happened. She was certain Yuko lived in Barrack 4, East Block 36. Chester's mother was puzzled. She knew that no one lived in that part of the camp. Despite Luce's certainty, the mother decided to investigate. That night, Chester's mother went to Barrack 4, following Luce's directions. Inside, she found only clutter and storage. It didn't look like anyone had ever lived there. Undeterred, she continued searching through the space, and in the corner, found a lamp and a clump of hair still attached to a piece of scalp. At the same time, Yuko, wearing her mask, had gone to see the doctor who had delivered Luce's babies. Believing that he was responsible for the babies' deaths, Yuko possessed the doctor. Under her control, the doctor picked up a surgical knife and committed seppuku, ending his own life. The show does not explicitly clarify whether the twins were stillborn or died shortly after birth. Yuko, in the form of a nurse, had been caring for Luce during her pregnancy. However, it seems Yuko had no malicious intent toward the babies. In fact, it appears she wanted Luce and her children to survive. Their deaths were an unforeseen tragedy. The scene shifts to February 4th, 1943, 5 months later. Chester receives a letter from his family, but this time, the news isn't joyful. They inform him that his 2 children have died. Chester is devastated by the news, and his spirits sink. At the Long Beach military port in California, there is constant activity as war supplies are loaded onto ships bound for the front lines. A Japanese-American soldier stands nearby looking vacant and detached, as if waiting for something. He mimics the same hand movements that Yuko made earlier. As the cargo is loaded and the transport ship prepares to depart, the soldier grabs his bag and boards the ship. The ship is heading to Guadalcanal, where Chester is stationed. As the soldier walks stiffly, a strange liquid begins seeping from his bag. Back at the internment camp, the U.S. government distributes a loyalty questionnaire to the Japanese-American residents, asking them to clarify their relationship with Japan and their loyalty to the United States. Amy's brother, who was released after being arrested, discusses the questionnaire with his companion Ken and others. Ken warns that they shouldn't fill it out too eagerly, as cooperating fully could later be used against them. For example, one question asks whether they would serve in the U.S. military if necessary. If they answer yes, the government might use that as a pretext to force Japanese Americans into military service. While the younger generation is resistant to the questionnaire, the older generation is more compliant, especially Yamato, who is the most eager of all. He fills out the questionnaire thoroughly, but when he runs out of space, he decides to confess something from his past to Major Bowen. Yamato tells the secretary Amy that back in 1925, he donated some tin foil to the Japanese Navy, but the questionnaire doesn't have enough room to write it down. Amy discreetly advises him that perhaps he doesn't need to mention it at all. Realizing her hint, Yamato quietly walks away. Soon after, Major Bowen arrives and begins venting to Amy about how frustrating the Japanese are. He complains that there are only 30 questions on this form. It should take 5 minutes to complete, but the Japanese drag it out forever. The government expects a 100% response rate, and Bowen is ready to punish anyone who refuses to cooperate. Amy senses that trouble is brewing in the camp. Amy couldn't help but fall for Ken, the young man she could interact with frequently. Their relationship blossomed, and to relieve some of the stress in the camp, they would occasionally sneak off for some hormone therapy. Amy asked Ken about the loyalty questionnaire, and it was clear that he had no intention of cooperating with Major Bowen. Regarding the question about joining the U.S. military to fight, Ken firmly said he wouldn't. Soon enough, Major Bowen's punishment orders were issued to the camp. If anyone refused to complete the questionnaire, the camp's supplies would be reduced. Ken led the charge, urging everyone to resist filling it out, protesting the questionnaire as illegal. But the reality was harsh. A soldier warned Ken that anyone who didn't comply would be charged with treason and face life imprisonment. Major Bowen gave Amy one last warning, telling her that if her boyfriend kept defying him, he'd end up in jail for treason. Desperate, Amy tried to convince Ken to cooperate, but he refused. One of the questions on the form asked if he was willing to serve in the U.S. military and be deployed to a designated location. He believed it was a trap, as saying yes would mean being drafted. Another question asked if he would unconditionally swear allegiance to the U.S. and renounce his loyalty to the Japanese emperor. Of course, Ken answered no to all of these. The deadline for submitting the forms arrived. Under Ken's influence, many young Japanese men in the camp also chose no for the critical questions. Amy realized that if Ken submitted his answers as they were, he'd be in serious trouble. Taking advantage of a moment when no one was watching in the office, she secretly changed his answers from no to yes. Shortly after, the military began rounding up those who answered no and placed them under stricter surveillance. The reasoning was that anyone unwilling to pledge unconditional loyalty to the U.S. posed a potential threat as an enemy of the state. Ken was fully expecting to be arrested, but to his surprise, he wasn't. His peers mocked him for being a coward, accusing him of backing out at the last minute while everyone else stood firm. Ken quickly realized that Amy had altered his answers. After everything settled, Ken confronted Amy, and the two had a heated argument. The scene then shifts to a group of children playing by the lake in the internment camp. Suddenly, they see a woman in white standing at the water's edge. The children are startled. It's Luz, who has been wandering aimlessly around the camp since losing her children. Her mental state has deteriorated, and Chester's parents, deeply saddened by her condition, feel powerless to help. Soon after, Luz's father arrives at the camp to take her home. Seeing the state she's in, he's heartbroken. He brings bad news that Luz's brother has died in combat in North Africa. Now that Luz has lost her children, her father believes it's time for her to come home with him. During an interview with a camp official, Luz is asked many questions about Japanese families. She remains silent until the officer asks about her children. At that moment, Luz finally speaks, saying she once had 2 children. After packing her belongings, Luz's father arrived at the internment camp to take her home. Before leaving, Luz gave the rattle that Yuko had gifted her to Chester's mother, asking her to pass it on to Yuko. Henry, who had once been cold and distant towards Luz, now saw her as part of the family. He even hugged her goodbye, urging her to live well. With that, Luz left the camp with her father. Back to Chester, he is still studying the notes of the Japanese soldiers. Through these notes, Chester learns that Admiral Takahashi had conducted psychological experiments on the sergeant, though the details are vague, leaving him unsure if others were affected. Just then, Chester's commanding officer arrives and calls for him and Ogawa. The U.S. military had recently captured a Japanese POW, but he's been difficult to handle, even for their top interrogation experts. Desperate, the officer calls on Chester and Ogawa to give it a try. As the three approach the POW tent, they see the seasoned interrogator being carried out, his ear having been bitten off by the prisoner. Inside, the crazed Japanese soldier is tied up, ranting and shouting. Chester examines the soldier's belongings before starting the interrogation. He's curious. This soldier survived a plane crash that killed all his comrades. The soldier's demeanor shifts immediately, claiming he's not human but an evil spirit, and he even addresses Chester by name. Chester is puzzled. If this man is truly an evil spirit, why is he following him? The soldier replies that he's here to save Chester, and that Chester must give him a knife so they can commit seppuku together and die in glory. If Chester doesn't comply, the soldier threatens to harm Chester's family. As the soldier rants, Chester quietly fiddles with something on the table. He then slowly steps back towards the soldier and in a swift move, snaps a photograph of him. Chester knows that if the man were truly a spirit, his image would come out blurred. When the photo develops and shows the man clearly, Chester realizes he's not an evil spirit, just a liar. The soldier had been trying to provoke Chester into killing him. Chester presses him further, asking how Admiral Takahashi would react if he knew what this soldier had done. The soldier, undeterred, responds confidently, knowing that as a POW he's safe from death for now. But once the war is over, he vows to hunt down Chester and his family. Infuriated, Chester beats him up, though in the process, the soldier begins to open up and reveal more. Meanwhile, outside the camp, a new group of translators arrives, including the man possessed by Yuko from earlier. In his bag is a corpse. At this point, Ogawa enters the tent and tells Chester that several new translators have joined their unit. He also warns Chester that if he doesn't get any more information from the Japanese soldier, the prisoner will be sent to a POW camp for further interrogation, which could involve torture. The soldier, not wanting to bring shame to his family, is desperate for an honorable death, believing it's the only way for him to find peace. In the end, Chester decides to give him the opportunity for an honorable death. He hands the soldier his sword, and the soldier chooses to end his life. Just before he dies, the soldier shares a crucial piece of information that Admiral Takahashi was born on June 7, 1894 in Sendai. He tells Chester to relay this information to his superiors, noting that it's more valuable than anything other prisoners had revealed. Chester reports the soldier's death to his superior, but lies about the circumstances, claiming the man broke free and killed himself when Chester wasn't paying attention. The officer doesn't question Chester's account, especially since he had managed to extract some valuable information about Admiral Takahashi. As the officer walks away, the screen subtly blurs, signaling the appearance of the evil spirit. Ogawa, stiffly carrying the same bag containing the corpse, enters the tent. Without warning, he strikes Chester, knocking him down, then pulls a gun on him and orders Chester to drive him away. Confused, Chester asks where they're going, and Ogawa responds, "Home." Soldiers notice the escape attempt and shout for them to stop, warning that they'll open fire if they don't. As gunfire erupts, Chester's car is hit, flipping over in the chaos. When Chester wakes up, he finds himself in a pit, with the corpse bag slowly opening beside him. The body inside reassembles itself, and the decayed figure approaches Chester, calling him Taizo and saying, "It's time to go home." From the previous episodes, we know that this rotting body is Yuko's true form. After all, she used it to kill the doctor in the internment camp. But we still didn't know why Yuko came all the way to the front lines to find Chester and why she called him Taizo. Clearly, their connection is deeper than expected. This episode also fills in a gap from the previous one regarding Admiral Takahashi. Based on Chester's investigation, it seems that the sergeant's madness was the result of psychological experiments conducted by Admiral Takahashi. The so-called evil spirits mentioned before likely didn't exist. There was only one Yuko all along. The scene then flashes back to 25 years ago, focusing on a young Yuko. She is in a room with Mr. Furuya, who is holding a photograph of Yuko. He says he couldn't believe he was so lucky to marry such a beautiful wife when Amy's father gave him this picture. As he finishes speaking, he attempts to initiate intimacy with Yuko, but she unexpectedly resists, clearly uncomfortable. Mr. Furuya is confused and asks why, since they're married now. In response, Yuko removes her outer clothing, revealing her stomach. She is pregnant. Yuko had intended to write a letter to inform Mr. Furuya before meeting him, but things took a different turn. Mr. Furuya angrily interrupts her, challenging her for why she kept something this important from him. Yuko pleads with him, suggesting he not react this way. The baby bump is still small, and when the child is born, they can just say it's his. Mr. Furuya refuses, enraged, telling her not to treat him like an idiot. Yuko tries to defuse the situation by saying that everyone thinks Mr. Furuya is a good man. However, he cannot forgive her and throws her out of the house. Yuko had made the long journey from Japan to the US, only to be cast out by her husband-to-be. A year later, Yuko gives birth to her child and wanders from place to place with the baby. But this situation is unsustainable. As she realizes she can no longer care for the child, she makes the heart-wrenching decision to leave the baby at an orphanage. After losing her child, Yuko is consumed by despair. What use is a woman who can't even care for her own child? One night, in the darkness, she walks to a bridge, her bag filled with stones, prepared to jump into the river and end her life. Just then, another woman approaches Yuko and asks her what's wrong. Yuko lies, saying she is just contemplating life. The woman shares that she used to come here often to think about life too. Sometimes she wonders if the world under the water is more peaceful, and whether all our troubles and sorrows could be washed away by the waves. But not all sadness can be escaped. After these words, the woman leaves. At this moment, the surroundings blur, suggesting that the woman might not be human, perhaps a spirit of some kind. After the woman departs, Yuko clutches her bag of stones and jumps into the water. The mysterious woman reappears on the bridge, silently watching everything unfold. The scene shifts, and Yuko wakes up in a bed, the buzzing of a fly faintly audible. Confused, she looks around as the same woman from before enters the room. The woman brings Yuko some food and tells her she saved her from the river. She reassures Yuko, telling her not to worry and to take her time recovering. Through Yuko's perspective, we see a classic Japanese estate, stunningly beautiful, almost like a painting. Yet, its eerie perfection creates an unsettling atmosphere. Yuko notices a four-petaled flower symbol on the woman's forehead, and she is intrigued, as this is the emblem of her ancestral family. When Yuko mentions this, the woman simply says it's a coincidence. She then shows Yuko around the garden. There, a gardener meticulously tends to the sand and plants, with everything in perfect order. The camera focuses on the two women from the waist up, again with a blurred effect around the edges, suggesting something isn't quite right. While Yuko is somewhat grateful to have been taken in by such a kind host, her thoughts keep returning to her child as she glances at the front gate. Slowly, she steps backward, almost into the carefully raked sand. The woman rushes over, visibly tense, and pulls Yuko back, explaining that she almost ruined the sand. It's clear there is more going on beneath the surface than meets the eye. The next day, the fly from earlier reappears, buzzing around Yuko's head. It's strange for such a beautiful place to have flies. Just like before, the woman brings Yuko breakfast. Suddenly, the fly lands on Yuko's hand, and she swats it dead. When she turns her head, the fly is gone again. After breakfast, the woman gives Yuko a bath. Yuko notices the walkway by the door and wonders why it's only half finished. She asks the woman about it, but the woman seems to avoid the question, and her hands start scrubbing Yuko more forcefully. Then the woman gives Yuko a red robe, and her increasingly odd behavior makes Yuko feel that something is not right. Later, while staring off into the distance from a bridge, Yuko sees a corpse floating in the water, wearing the same red robe the woman had just given her. The gardener also begins walking toward her in a disturbingly eerie manner. Panicking, Yuko runs toward the entrance, but as she steps off the walkway and into the sand, she suddenly begins to sink. Just when she is about to suffocate, the woman reappears and pulls her out. The scene resets. Once again, we see the fly, the woman, and the breakfast. Yuko becomes more curious about where she is. The woman assures her that this place is paradise, that everything is perfect. But Yuko can't feel at ease. Her child is still out there, and she wants to leave. The woman tells Yuko to forget about the child, saying it's all over and that this feeling of attachment is what the priest would call resentment. It's now clear that Yuko is dead, and everything she once had is gone. The woman warns Yuko that she had tried to stop her from jumping off the bridge, but Yuko didn't listen. She explains that she had to go to great lengths to pull Yuko up from the depths of the river, and now it won't be easy to leave. The woman reveals that Yuko ended up here because they are related by blood. It turns out the woman is Yuko's ancestor. Although several generations apart, their connection remains strong. Yuko refuses to accept this explanation. In a fit of anger, she grabs a kettle and hits the woman, but when she turns around, the woman is standing right next to her, unharmed. It seems there is no way for Yuko to escape. The next day, Yuko wakes up again in the same setting. After breakfast, the woman begins teaching Yuko how to write. Curious, Yuko asks the woman if the woman in the water, wearing the red robe, is her daughter, and if the one in the sand is her daughter too. She confronted the woman for why she condemned her daughter to that sandy hell and why she didn't save her. The woman, visibly angry, snaps back, explaining that it was her daughter's fault. She insists that her daughter was disobedient and that's why she ended up in the sand. Of course, horror stories don't need perfect logic. The point is clear enough. As Yuko continues to question her, the woman steps into the sand without realizing it, and soon she is dragged under. Yuko doesn't help her. She lets her sink completely. The sky turns from bright to dark, and the sand returns to normal. Seizing her chance, Yuko runs toward the front gate. She opens it, only to be blocked by thick bushes. Desperate, she fights her way through them. Once she gets out, Yuko has transformed into a ghostly corpse, and time has jumped forward 21 years to 1941. The scene switches to July 3rd, 1943. 5 months have passed. A military truck enters the internment camp, and Chester is aboard. After suffering serious injuries in the earlier accident, Chester has been discharged from the army. His mother informs him that Luz has left with her father, which leaves Chester feeling deeply saddened. He visits the graves of his children to mourn. Suddenly, Amy's mother approaches and blames Chester for the deaths of her husband and the Furuya couple. She accuses him of being the cause of his own children's deaths as well. Chester's mother is deeply upset by these accusations against her son and confronts Amy's mother, starting a heated argument that escalates into a physical altercation. Meanwhile, Yuko watches them from afar. After Amy's mother leaves, Chester's mother tries to comfort him, telling him that it wasn't his fault. But before she can finish speaking, Yuko possesses her. Chester, noticing his mother's strange behavior, yells at the evil spirit to leave her body. Furious, Yuko, speaking through Chester's mother, grabs Chester by the throat, repeatedly saying the name Taizo. Just as Chester is about to be strangled to death, Yuko snaps out of it, and her ghost leaves his mother's body. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, Chester's parents decide to tell him the truth. It turns out that Yuko is actually Chester's mother's older sister. Mr. Furuya had rejected Yuko, and in her despair, she chose to end her life. Chester, whose real name is Taizo, is Yuko's son. At the time of Yuko's death, her sister was still in Japan, unaware of what had happened. When Yuko died, her sister's family learned of it, took Taizo in from the orphanage, and gave him a new name, Chester. Chester's father, a soldier, had already died in battle. Overwhelmed by the revelations, Chester storms out of the house. The scene cuts to the camp square, where Yuko is seen staring at a woman holding a baby, muttering Taizo over and over. In the next moment, Yuko is cradling the woman's baby, softly singing as she walks toward the cemetery. The baby does not follow her into the afterlife, and Yuko realizes what her ancestor had told her before: only those with blood ties can enter this realm. At the same time, Chester hears a baby crying near the cemetery. When he approaches, he sees Yuko holding the child. Soon after, Yamato and others take Yuko's physical body into a room. As previously mentioned, Yamato knows a bit about exorcism and spiritual rituals. The only way to stop Yuko's spirit from returning is to destroy her sexy body. Yamato takes a brush and paints religious scriptures on Yuko's body. They bind her hands and stinky feet, then pour gasoline around the room and pile it with firewood. Chester lights the fire without mercy, and as the flames engulf the room, Yuko, in the afterlife, feels the intense heat. When she opens the door, all she sees is fire. However, this is not the end of the story. Yuko's song begins to play again, and footprints appear in the ashes. The depiction of the afterlife in this episode is somewhat mysterious. It might represent an alternate world created by Yuko's ancestors, a realm only accessible to those with familial ties. After learning that Chester has a child, Yuko's vengeful spirit becomes fixated on the baby. After all, Yuko lost Taizo when he was just an infant. The deaths of the Furuya couple and Amy's father are all connected to Yuko's grievances. Mrs. Furuya prepared the abortion medicine for Chester, Mr. Furuya abandoned Yuko, and Amy's father was the one who introduced Yuko to Furuya. The scene shifts to a doctor performing a skin graft on a corpse. During the procedure, the doctor himself begins to convulse. After completing the surgery, he injects himself and dies, while the corpse on the operating table comes back to life. The revived woman walks to a mirror and starts applying makeup. It's Yuko. The question arises, how did Yuko escape the fire from earlier? Yamato had covered her body with sacred inscriptions, and by the usual rules, Yuko shouldn't have been able to escape. However, it turns out that the inscriptions weren't on Yuko's actual body. They were on skin she had grafted onto herself later. When the skin burned, the inscriptions burned away with it, allowing Yuko to flee from the fire. Additionally, when Yuko pushed her ancestor into the sand previously, the once sunny realm shifted to darkness, indirectly confirming that Yuko is a malevolent spirit. Her ancestor had tried to prevent her from ending her own life, but Yuko's goal was to take her relatives with her, showing a clear difference in their intentions. Turning to Chester, he's talking to Amy about Luz. Communication between the camp and the outside world has been cut off, except for Major Bowen's private line, so Chester wants to use Bowen's phone to contact Luz. Amy advises against it, warning him that Bowen's office has recording devices and that they could all end up being sent to Tule Lake, a prison-like camp for dissenters. Since discovering the truth about his parentage, Chester has distanced himself from his adoptive parents, Henry and Yuko's sister. He feels betrayed and accuses them of lying to him. When calling doesn't work, Chester decides to write letters. Chester writes letter after letter to Luz, but she never opens any of them. Luz's father encourages her to go out and meet new people. He even introduces her to an eligible American boy from a well-off family, suggesting Luz go on a date with him. He also offers to return Chester's letters if Luz doesn't want them. Just as Chester is about to send another letter, he receives a package from Luz's family. He thinks it's a response from Luz, but when he opens it, he finds all of his unopened letters inside. The realization hits him. Luz hasn't read a single one of the letters he painstakingly wrote. Chester dropped the letter and headed straight for the gate of the internment zone. The soldier guarding the entrance raised his gun, warning Chester that if he took another step forward, he would open fire. Chester, unimpressed, told the soldier dismissively to go ahead. Upon hearing this, the guard didn't shoot immediately, but instead gave Chester a brutal beating before taking him to see Major Bowen. Major Bowen becomes hostile as Chester continues to cause trouble in the camp. Chester's mother goes to plead with Bowen to forgive Chester this time, but Bowen flatly refuses. Chester is set to be sent to the Tule Lake internment camp, a place for those seen as agitators. As Chester prepares to leave, Bowen asks him if he has any final words for his parents, but Chester coldly responds that his parents are already dead. After Chester departs, his mother looks at the letters on the ground, and it seems she starts to realize something important. That night, shortly after Chester leaves, an emergency situation arises in the camp. Many people begin falling ill with fevers and coughs, including Mr. Furuya's only son. Amy and the others rush him to the medical ward, only to find it already full of patients. Ken, who is volunteering there, tells them the number of sick people is rapidly increasing, and even the camp's 2 doctors have fallen ill. If the situation continues to worsen, the entire camp could be at risk. The best course of action would be to send the sick to a hospital or bring in real doctors to treat them. Ken urges Amy to speak to Major Bowen and explain the seriousness of the situation, asking him to report the outbreak. Meanwhile, Bowen is at home shaving when he suddenly hears footsteps outside. It's Yuko, who sneaks into Chester's room under the cover of night, only to find that he's already been taken away earlier that day. His belongings are still there, along with the letters he had been sending to Luz. Yuko picks up one of the letters and notices Luz's address on it. Believing that Chester might have gone to Luz's house, she decides to leave and follow him. Just as she's about to exit, Major Bowen steps out, hearing noises outside. Yuko possesses Bowen, giving him a harsh lesson in the process. Chester is being escorted by soldiers on his way to the Tule Lake internment camp. While crossing a bridge, Chester claims he needs to relieve himself. Seizing the moment when the guards relax, he jumps off the bridge and escapes. Back at the camp, Major Bowen is still shaken from the encounter with Yuko's spirit, looking disheveled. Amy approaches him to report a severe outbreak of illness in the camp, warning that if it isn't controlled and treated soon, more people will get sick. However, Bowen shows no concern for the plague. Instead, he's fixated on the evil spirit, stating that if no one in the camp explains what's happening with the ghost, then all the sickness and disease are just what the Japanese deserve. As they talk, the soldiers who had been guarding Chester return. Bowen immediately realizes that Chester has escaped. Amy tells Ken about Bowen's refusal to report the outbreak, and also informs Chester's adoptive parents of his escape, leaving the elderly couple feeling helpless. Later that night, Ken goes to confront Major Bowen. Bowen, still terrified from his encounter with Yuko, mistakenly believes Ken has been sent by her. Confused, Ken tries to explain that he's there to report the illness outbreak, but Bowen doesn't listen and starts beating him. The two end up in a fight. Ken manages to disarm Bowen and gain control of the situation. The next morning, Amy notices that Major Bowen hasn't shown up for work and goes to his house to check on him. When she knocks on the door, she finds Ken inside. Ken explains that he has captured Bowen and plans to deal with him once he wakes up. Taking advantage of this moment, Amy rushes to Bowen's office and calls the hospital, requesting ambulances to come and treat the sick in the camp. Just as she hangs up, a U.S. soldier discovers her. With no choice, Amy takes the soldier to Bowen's room. She informs Ken that she has notified the hospital and their primary goal, getting the sick people treated, is being achieved. Ken cooperates, handing over the gun and releasing Bowen. Though it seemed the situation had been resolved peacefully, the worst was yet to come. Ken believed the worst consequence he'd face was being sent to Tule Lake, but instead, Bowen executes him. The patients who were sent to the hospital receive timely care and begin to recover. One of the nurses even praises Bowen, saying the Japanese are lucky to have such a good man looking out for them. Henry and his wife exchange awkward glances, knowing the truth. After Ken's death, Bowen takes full control over Amy. He moves their meetings from his office to his private quarters. It was clear from the start when Bowen hired Amy that he viewed her with contempt, and now he sees the perfect opportunity to act on his desires. However, Amy had planned for this. She had placed a hidden recorder in Bowen's home and turned it on. The scene cuts to Luce, who is on a date with a man her father had set her up with. While the man is clearly interested in Luce, she shows no interest in him. As they chat, Luce notices a familiar car parked outside her house. It's Chester's car. She walks over and sure enough, it's him. Despite everything, Luce still loves Chester. She had been trying to move on, believing that time would help her forget, but Chester's sudden appearance reignites all the emotions she had been suppressing. Her grief and longing, which she had kept buried for so long, flood back all at once. Before entering the internment camp, Chester had left his car with his former teacher, who had taken good care of it. Now, he tells Luz that if she's willing, they could take a spontaneous road trip together. Luz is intrigued by the idea, as she had been wanting to visit a certain place. She heads back inside, packs her bags, and grabs a bunch of gasoline ration coupons from her father's stash, ready to embark on the journey with Chester. While Luz is back at home packing, Chester sneaks into the orphanage where he was adopted. Searching through the orphanage's files, he discovers something shocking. He has a twin brother named Jiro. Chester wasn't the only one sent to the orphanage. His twin brother had also been there. After meeting up with Luz, Chester tells her about his twin. According to the records, Jiro was sent to a children's hospital when he was 8 months old, and there has been no record of him since. However, there's no time to worry about this right now. Luz shares her plans to visit New Mexico, her mother's homeland, to reconnect with her grandmother's family. After a long journey, Chester and Luz finally arrive in New Mexico, where Luz is reunited with her family. Seeing Luz smile again fills Chester with happiness, knowing his efforts weren't in vain. After talking with her family, Luz invites Chester to stay and live with them. Chester smiles and agrees. Luz's father returned home in the evening. He finds a letter from Luz, which leaves him feeling a bit down. Just then, he hears a noise coming from the next room. When he investigates, he finds Yuko. Unaware of who she is, Luz's father is quickly possessed by Yuko, who uses him to learn about Chester and Luz's whereabouts before killing him. Back to Chester, he has stayed in New Mexico and settled into a domestic routine, hoping that everything is now behind him. However, he can't shake the feeling that Yuko is always lurking close by. At this point, neither he nor Luz knows about the murder of Luz's father. One evening, Chester is at home, organizing documents related to his missing brother. He has written to every place that might have taken him in, but so far, he hasn't received any responses. Meanwhile, Chester and Luz have rekindled their hormone relationship and become intimate again. Little did they know, Yuko is hiding in a nearby shack, not far from where they are. The storyline then shifts to the internment camp. With the changing dynamics of World War II between Japan and the U.S., some Japanese-American residents of the camp have been granted partial freedom. If a U.S. citizen is willing to sponsor and offer them employment, they can leave the camp. Chester's father has filled out an application, hoping to get his wife and himself out of the camp. He explains to the reviewing officer that his sponsor is a canning factory owner who has offered him a job as a gardener. Though Chester's father has no experience in gardening, he's determined to do whatever it takes to get his wife out. After reviewing the application, the officer approves their request. The U.S. government, which prides itself on its commitment to democracy and freedom, knows it can't hold Japanese Americans in camps for so long without offering some form of compensation. Chester's father opens an envelope to find $25. The officer smirks, explaining that it's $25 per person, so they receive $50 in total, along with a ticket for the journey home. On the other side, Amy secretly recorded Major Bowen exploiting her. This recording, along with other incriminating information, was submitted to the U.S. government, leading to Bowen's reassignment. Amy thought her life would return to normal, but to her dismay, Major Bowen is back after only a few days. She knows something is wrong. As time goes by, Luce is pregnant once more. Under the guidance of Luce's grandmother, Chester and Luce hold an official wedding ceremony, finally bringing their love story to a happy conclusion. Their loved ones gather to offer their blessings. Among them is an old woman who enthusiastically embraces the couple. After the guests leave, the woman's true nature is revealed. It's Yuko who has arrived. After their wedding, Chester and Luce continued to live with Luce's grandmother. Life was relatively peaceful. One day, 2 police officers showed up at the house, which initially alarmed everyone as they thought they had come to arrest Chester. However, to their surprise, the police were there to inform Luce that her father had gone missing. After the officers left, the family began discussing Luce's father. Her grandmother said he was a stable and responsible man, not someone who would simply vanish without a trace. She suggested there might be a way to find out if he was still alive. It turned out that Luce's grandmother was a witch who practiced some ancient rituals, and the family had long believed in such practices. Chester was intrigued, wondering if she could really communicate with the dead. The grandmother clarified that she couldn't speak to the dead, but she could tell through a photograph whether someone was still alive. According to her, a person's soul disperses into their flesh, hair, and even their photograph after they die. If she sensed a soul in the photo, it would mean that person had passed away. However, using this magic came with risks. Some people who attempted it had never woken up. After thinking for a moment, Chester decided to test it with a photo of his missing brother. The grandmother quickly set up an altar, preparing for the seance. She took off a necklace that Luce's mother had given to her and handed it to Chester. The family had a witch's bloodline, and this necklace appeared to have special powers. She tells Chester that if they couldn't find his brother, that would be something to celebrate, but if they did, it would be cause for sorrow. After a series of incantations, Chester found himself transported into the photograph, where he indeed saw his brother. It turned out that when Chester's father took him away, his brother had been in the hospital receiving treatment, and they missed the chance to reunite. The reason for his brother's death wasn't explained. Chester noticed his brother holding a baseball glove, so the two played catch for a while. As they were enjoying their game in this otherworldly realm, Yuko suddenly appeared and possessed Chester's body. Luce, terrified, tried to wake Chester up, but her grandmother stopped her, calmly extinguishing the fire and saying that the magic must be controlled by her. In this other realm, Yuko approached Jiro and told him she's his mother and had been looking for him and his brother for a long time. Now, she's back to make things right. She embraced Jiro and the two were swallowed by the sand. Yuko had taken Jiro's soul. When Chester woke up, he saw that Jiro had disappeared from the photograph. He now realized that Yuko was still very much present, close by. The scene then shifts back to the internment camp. Amy's brother and simply returning alive to the internment camp is a mark of great honor. Earlier, Amy had written to her brother, telling him about how she had sent a tape recording to Washington. He warned her that it was a bad idea since Major Bowen had powerful connections, and if nothing had happened to him yet, it meant the tape had never reached Washington. As they spoke, Major Bowen approached the brother, inviting him for a chat, as he was now a war hero fresh off the battlefield. As a member of the renowned 442nd, Amy's brother's return sparked a surge of enlistment interest in the camp. Many young men eagerly filled out forms, expressing their willingness to join the U.S. Army and fight for America. Among them was Mr. Furuya's only son, who also signed up. It was only then that he revealed the harsh truth to the boy. The 442nd was often sent to places that white soldiers didn't want to go, and the regiment suffered casualties faster than it could get reinforcements. In fact, the military had sent Amy's brother back to the camp to make recruitment look more glamorous. It was a dangerous mission, and he knew the boy wasn't mentally prepared. The boy had become twisted by grief, having lost his entire family, and was uncertain how long he would remain in what felt like a prison. Now, all he wanted to do was kill. Reluctantly, he accepted the boy's enlistment. Back at the camp, Major Bowen was up to something. He pretended to know nothing about the tape and, in an unusual move, was very kind to Amy. He offered her job opportunities outside the camp and introduced her to potential sponsors. He even threw a dance in her brother's honor, making Amy believe that he had truly changed. However, during the dance, while Amy let her guard down, Bowen spiked her drink with a sedative. He then tied her sexy body up and restrained her. It turned out that the tape Amy had sent to Washington had been intercepted by Major Bowen. The recording included his confession to ordering Ken's murder. Bowen didn't just kill Amy because he was obsessed with her. He told her that if she could stay calm and discuss their future, he might let her go. But the moment Bowen removed the gag from her smelly mouth, Amy screamed for help. Seeing her defiance, Bowen decided to teach her a lesson by breaking one of her fingers. This broken finger turned out to be Amy's chance. The camp's electricity was unstable, causing the lights to flicker constantly. Amy began to taunt Bowen, asking if he had encountered the evil spirit Yuko and whether he wanted her to possess him again. Her words made Bowen increasingly nervous. Taking advantage of the flickering lights, Amy managed to use the space created by her broken finger to slip free from the ropes. She grabbed a chair and knocked Bowen out, then drowned him in a puddle. Returning to Chester and Luz, Chester finally opens up to Luz about his experiences in the military, particularly with the evil spirit Yuko. But something doesn't add up. He had already burned Yuko into ashes back in the internment camp, so she shouldn't be here. Luz is surprised to hear Yuko's name and says Yuko is the midwife who helped her. She was so kind to her in the camp. If she's an evil spirit, why would she do that? Chester suddenly remembers the wedding photo. Taking a closer look, he notices something strange. In the photo of Luz with the old woman, the woman's face is blurred, an unmistakable sign that Yuko's spirit has possessed her. Realizing the danger, Chester rushes to the old woman's house late that night, only to find the old woman dead like a piece of soap on the couch. In her lifeless hand, she's clutching a baby's outfit embroidered with a 4-leaf clover. Chester brings the outfit back to Luz and tells her about the old woman's death. As Luz sees the baby clothes, she realizes that Yuko isn't after Chester. She's after their unborn child. The scene shifts to the afterlife, where Chester's twin brother Jiro wakes up in bed. Yuko comforts him, telling him not to worry. Soon, the three of them will be reunited. In the distance, a baby's cradle rocks gently, clearly meant for Chester and Luz's unborn child. The scene shifts to January 29, 1945. The Japanese Americans in the internment camp are finally being released, following a U.S. Supreme Court ruling that they are to be reintegrated into society. On this significant day, Major Bowen is absent because, unbeknownst to the U.S. government, he is dead, lying in the basement of a camp building. Chester's adoptive parents, Amy and Yamato, are all set free, along with the other detainees. During a rest stop on their journey home, Henry talks excitedly about the future, saying when they get back, they'll fix up the house, repair the boat, and start over again. The mother, however, is deeply worried about Chester, wondering if he's waiting for them at home. Although the couple kept Chester's true parentage a secret all these years, they devoted their lives to raising him as their own. They don't harbor any resentment toward him, only sorrow for how things have turned out. Soon, the bus takes them back to their former home, but when they arrive, they are met with a devastating sight. The land had been leveled by the U.S. government, fenced off, and claimed as government property. 6 months later, Henry had found a job as a gardener, working for an American employer, helping to maintain the garden. The boss, who thought highly of Henry, asked if he had a place to live and offered to rent him one of the houses he owned just a few blocks away. Henry politely declined, saying that he and his wife had already found a place. In reality, they hadn't. He and Chester's mother were still living in an overcrowded temporary housing unit where multiple families were crammed together, sleeping on bunk beds. In the middle of the night, Henry received a phone call from Chester, who begged his adoptive father not to hang up, saying he was in trouble and needed his family's help. After leaving the internment camp, Chester and Luz had moved to New Mexico, where they got married and had another child. They had thought that Yuko's presence was dealt with back in the camp, but to their horror, she had followed them there. Upon hearing the call, Henry and his wife dropped everything and immediately caught a bus to New Mexico the next day. As they say, a parent's heart knows no bounds. In New Mexico, Henry made a blunt remark to Luz that he's sorry she married an idiot, but at least Chester is not his blood. This line called back to a conversation Chester had with his father in the past, where Chester had said Yuko is his blood and Henry is nothing. The strong dramatic tension here further emphasized the complexities of their relationship and the difficulties of parenthood. Meanwhile, in the afterlife, Jiro awoke to find flies buzzing around him. Yuko had prepared breakfast for him, and Jiro curiously asked who the baby cradle next to him was for. Yuko comforted him, telling him not to worry, and his twin brother Taizo will be joining them soon, and they'll be reunited as a family. Back in New Mexico, Luz was nearing her due date, and the family was on high alert. They boarded up the doors and windows, and anyone entering or leaving had to use a secret code. Even the town priest was no exception. Chester's adoptive mother sat quietly, staring at the photo of Jiro after his disappearance. As the priest walked by, she suddenly saw a vision of herself playing chess with Jiro. Sensing something was off, Chester asked his mother if everything was all right, to which she only replied that Jiro must have really enjoyed playing chess. The priest then asked Chester if he was really going to let Luz give birth here. Chester had no other choice. They still didn't know where Yuko was. If things got worse, the plan was to move the family again after the birth, staying on the run from city to city until the baby was safe. Henry remained on high alert, watching every suspicious person in the area, not letting his guard down for a moment. He reminded Chester that constantly running wasn't a solution. If Chester truly loved Luz, he should distance himself from her rather than bring her pain. But at this point, it was too late for that. After waiting for a long time, Luz finally went into labor. Just then, someone knocked on the door. Luz's grandmother peered through the window and saw the priest. He gave the correct passcode, but his behavior was odd, clearly indicating that this was not the real priest. Luz, terrified, exclaimed that the evil spirit had possessed him. Her cousin tackled the priest, who was possessed by the spirit, while Chester seized the moment to get Luz and the family into the car to escape. The scene shifts to the group arriving at an abandoned military cave. Luz and two others went deep into the cave to prepare for the birth, while Chester and his father Henry stayed by the entrance. Chester tied a rope with a bell to the door. If anything entered, the bell would ring. Henry, growing frustrated, asked Chester if where he planned on taking Luz. Chester replied that he would know soon enough. Irritated, Henry pressed further, saying if he asked them to help, why he wouldn't tell him his plan. But Chester remained silent, unwilling to reveal more. Seeing this, Henry dropped the issue. After setting up the alarm system, the two joined the others in the cave. Everything was prepared and Luz went into labor. Fortunately, it went smoothly, and she gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The arrival of new life brought a moment of joy to the group. But suddenly, the bell at the entrance rang, suggesting something had come in. Chester and Henry went outside but found nothing. It turned out that a rat had tripped the bell's rope. Chester then pulled out a photograph he had found earlier while organizing records at the orphanage. It was a picture of him as a baby. Finally, Chester revealed his plan. He explained that when he asked Luz's grandmother to perform the seance, he had hoped to find out if Jiro was still alive through the photo. But instead, Yuko found Jiro's soul. The reason Yuko was haunting them now was that she was trying to reclaim her son, Taizo, who was Chester as a child. Chester explained that if Yuko's wish was fulfilled, she would stop pursuing Luz and their baby. Henry suggested giving the photo to Luz's grandmother so she could summon Yuko, but Chester shook his head, explaining that it wasn't that simple. The ritual only worked if someone was dead. Only if Chester died would his soul attach to the photo, allowing Yuko to take the young Taizo in the picture. This meant the only way to stop her was for Chester to sacrifice himself. Henry never imagined that his seemingly rebellious son would turn out to be such a responsible man. Chester pleaded with his father not to follow him, and then, gun in hand, he ran out of the cave intending to end his life. Inside the room, after giving birth, Luz felt something strange, wondering why her baby hadn't cried at all. The three women suspected that Yuko had possessed the baby. Chester has made it outside with the gun. A middle-aged man noticed him, and through his drunken ramblings, we learned that they were celebrating the success of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Just as the man was about to question Chester further, Henry arrived and knocked him out. Back in the bunker, the baby finally started crying, which initially seemed like a good sign. But then Yuko's spirit transferred into Luz's grandmother. Yuko told Luz that Taizo is her own child and tried to take the baby away. At this moment, Yuko's sister called out to her, revealing a long-kept secret. She told Yuko that years ago, the person who was supposed to marry Mr. Furuya wasn't Yuko, but herself. Yuko's true match had been Henry. However, upon hearing that Mr. Furuya was not a good man, Yuko's sister had second thoughts. She arranged for the matchmaking partner to be swapped. Thus, the sister had lived all these years with Yuko's son and the man who was meant to be her husband. It seemed like the sister was about to apologize for this, but in a shocking twist, she said she had no regrets. In fact, if given the choice again, she would do the same thing. Furious, Yuko grabbed her by the throat. Hearing the chicken screams from inside, Chester and Henry rushed in. To their horror, they found both Chester's mother and Luz's grandmother lying on the ground, wounded. It turned out that Yuko had possessed Luz's baby in the womb when they escaped, and just now she had transferred from the grandmother into Luz. Now, with Yuko in control of Luz's body, she took the baby and fled. Chester chased after her, but by the time he got outside, Yuko had already disappeared with the child. Apparently, Yuko's obsession with her child, especially with Taizo as a baby, are what turned her into an evil spirit. Her fixation on her child, starting from the moment she died and her soul was taken to heaven by her ancestors, fueled her return. That's why, over more than 20 years, driven by pure resentment, she broke through the barrier between life and death. There are two ways to dispel Yuko's spirit. One is total destruction, like the cremation attempted previously. However, that method is extremely difficult, and those involved weren't skilled enough to completely eliminate her. The second way is to calm the anger and obsession that torment Yuko. Only then can her spirit finally rest. The scene shifts to Yamato walking down a rural road. Along the way, he encounters an old Japanese friend from decades ago. His friend tells him that this is heaven and they never expect to meet here after death. Yamato goes on to share the story of his life. After the two were separated, his friend followed his father to Hiroshima, where he settled, married, and had children. Now he even has several grandchildren. Yamato was about to congratulate him, but when he glanced behind his friend, he saw the entire family standing together. They had all come to heaven. His friend's great-granddaughter's face still bore the marks of burns. Suddenly, Yamato wakes from the dream. The street outside is unusually loud, and the Japanese Americans inside the room are all waking up, confused by the commotion. Outside, people are celebrating as if it were Christmas. When Yamato and the others step outside to ask what's going on, they learn that the US has successfully dropped another atomic bomb on Hiroshima, and now Japan must surrender to the American government. For Japanese Americans, this news brings mixed emotions. Turning to Luz, who's now possessed by Yuko, she walks down the road holding a child. A family of 3 passes by and, seeing Luz alone, kindly offers her a ride. Luz oddly smiles and gets into their car. Meanwhile, Chester is driving home with the injured ladies. While unloading luggage, he finds some protective charms given by Yamato, leading him to a realization. After Chester's mother is bandaged, they split up to search for Luz and the child, Chester alone while his parents team up. Shortly after, Chester finds Luz by the roadside, holding what looks like a baby. He rushes over and snatches it from her, only to discover it's just a bundle of clothes. It turns out the evil spirit has left Luz's body, taking the child with it. Henry and his wife also sensed that something was wrong. They discovered a car by the side of the road, with the bodies of a couple inside. These were the kind-hearted people who had earlier offered Luz a ride. It was clear they had fallen victim to Yuko's wrath, but their daughter was missing. As it turned out, after killing the couple, Yuko had possessed their daughter, and she had taken Chester and Luz's baby to the cabin where Yuko's original body was. Chester first took Luz home, and then Henry returned as well. After gathering all the clues, Chester asked his father to take him to the spot where the couple had been found. As Chester examined the bodies, the possessed little girl wandered out from the woods, dazed and confused. She kept repeating that she didn't kill them. It was the woman holding the baby. Chester immediately realized that the woman she was referring to was Yuko. Meanwhile, Yuko was preparing to take the baby and reunite with her family in the afterlife. They followed the girl's guide and found the cabin, which was filled with baby items and toys, and the walls were covered in names of Chester's ancestors. It was clear that Yuko had been preparing for this moment for months. Chester was determined to go through with his plan, to sacrifice himself to quell Yuko's vengeful spirit. He asked Henry to give the photo of him as a child to Luz's grandmother after he was gone, so she could perform the final step of the ritual. This would allow Yuko to take baby Taizo from the photograph and leave Luz's baby alone. Henry hesitated. Despite the tension between them, Chester was still the boy he had raised. As they followed the clues, they finally found Yuko deep in the woods. She had dug a grave and was preparing to leave with the baby. Chester called out to her, telling her that the child she was holding wasn't Taizo. He was. The one she wanted to take was him. In Yuko's memory, Taizo was still a baby, so she couldn't reconcile this grown man standing before her. Chester explained his plan. Henry had a photo of him as a baby, and after his death, Luz's grandmother would use her magic to let Yuko enter the photo and take baby Taizo, his infant self. At that moment, Henry emerged, holding Chester's childhood photo. But suddenly, he tore the photo to pieces, declaring that the mistakes of the past won't be carried by their children. He then aimed his gun at Yuko and fired. The reason Henry did what he did was because he had already figured out a way to deal with Yuko. He handed Chester the prayer scrolls he had prepared earlier. Chester, remembering they hadn't worked before, expressed doubt. But Henry insisted, saying, "They'll work. Yuko is under control now, and he's going to burn her." He then urged Chester to take the baby and leave. As Yuko struggled, she tore off the scrolls and stabbed Henry. Possessing his body, Yuko shot Chester, hitting him in the leg and knocking him to the ground. In the end, Henry turned the gun on himself. Both Chester and his father were no match for Yuko. After wounding Chester, Yuko carried the baby into the graveyard. Not long after, Luz and Chester's mother arrived, finding Chester injured and Henry dead. Chester's mother was devastated. Just then, Yuko crawled out of the grave, her body covered in strips of cloth inscribed with the prayer scrolls. It turned out, while Yuko had been distracted taking the baby, Henry, with the last of his strength, had thrown the remaining scrolls into the grave. Enraged, Chester's mother repeatedly stabbed Yuko's body with a knife, but Chester warned her that it wouldn't work. Yuko's soul wouldn't be destroyed as long as it remained unrestful, and she would always find a way to return. At that moment, Luz pulled out a photo of Yuko from her youth, suggesting there might be another way to calm Yuko's spirit. Luz had discovered the photo among Yuko's sister's belongings, indicating that the sister had always felt guilty about Yuko's death. Luz quickly set up a ritual to begin a seance. Chester then spoke to Yuko, telling her that if she took his son, there would be no one left to remember her. What Yuko truly longed for was the time when both Taizo and Jiro were still in her womb. Chester's words struck a chord with Yuko, causing her to realize what she just wanted was Taizo as a baby, frozen in that moment. Seeing the photo of her younger self, Yuko decided to return to that time when the photo was taken. Chester reassured her, saying both he and Jiro were in her womb. She sacrificed herself for them. Now let them live on and they will remember her, and her sacrifice won't be in vain. With that, Yuko finally let go of her obsession. Chester and his family were safe at last, but Henry had sacrificed his life for them. The scene then shifts to Chester holding a funeral for his adoptive father. Many friends and family members came to mourn this man who deeply loved and cared for his family. Chester reflected on a memory from years ago when he had taken a photo of his father, remembering how Henry had carried the burden of the family on his shoulders. It was at this moment that Chester truly understood his father's stubbornness and the responsibilities he had pursued. Fast forward to the year 1950, Chester has opened a photography studio, capturing memories of his friends and family and, of course, Chester, Luz, and their 3 children. With that, the drama concludes here.